guys, tonight we're about to dive into the ancient world of Roman winters. Picture it. You're huddled in your home, a crackling fire in the hearth, flickering weakly against the biting chill of a Roman winter night. You probably won't survive this. That's not a threat, but more of a reality check about just how brutal it must have been to keep warm back then. No central heating, no cozy electric blankets, just you, your toga, and a desperate prayer that the fire doesn't go out. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're in the middle of winter, or maybe it's toasty where you are, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where everyone is tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Winter in ancient Rome wasn't exactly the kind of snow globe wonderland you might picture today. It could get cold, really cold. In fact, the Roman Empire stretched across vast regions, meaning that winters varied from frigid and damp in the north to cooler, more temperate conditions in the Mediterranean. But the average Roman home, particularly in the city, was not built for such temperatures. They didn't have modern insulation. Instead, they relied on thick walls made from brick, stone, and wood, which, while sturdy, offered little protection from the cold. Imagine the chill creeping through those narrow windows that weren't exactly designed for keeping heat in. The cold could easily take hold of a Roman villa or apartment, no matter how grand or humble. And while winters in Rome weren't as brutal as, say, the Northern European winters, they still weren't exactly pleasant. When the temperatures dropped, so did your chances of staying warm. But Romans had their own unique ways of dealing with the cold, and they definitely weren't afraid to get creative. Historians still argue whether the discomfort of the cold led to more social gatherings, with the warmth of a shared fire often drawing families and neighbors together. But one thing's for sure, the ancient Romans were resourceful when it came to staying warm, using everything from simple fires to advanced architectural systems. Now, imagine stepping into a typical Roman home. The floor is rough, uneven, maybe even a bit damp, thanks to the ever-present humidity of Rome. If you're in an insula, one of those multi-story apartment blocks, it's cramped and there's a definite chill in the air. The windows, small and mostly barred, offering little ventilation, but even less insulation. If you're lucky enough to be in a domus, a private Roman house, you might have a bit more space, but that doesn't mean warmth comes easily. Roman homes, for the most part, were not designed with cold weather in mind. The walls were thick, sure, but they were designed to keep the heat out in summer, not in during the winter. In fact, The architecture of the time wasn't really about keeping things cozy when the mercury dropped. Roman homes were often made with materials like brick, concrete, and stone. These materials didn't have the same insulating qualities we think of today. So, during the winter months, you could easily find yourself shivering in a cold, damp room, even if you had a roaring fire in the corner. The heat would rise from the hearth, but it would dissipate just as quickly, leaving the upper rooms freezing and the lower levels stuffy and smoke-filled. And don't even get me started on the floors. If you were in a poorer insula, you likely had a dirt or stone floor, which did nothing to keep the cold out. Even if you were a bit more fortunate and lived in a domus, you probably had unheated stone floors that radiated cold up into your bones. Not exactly a great place to curl up with a good book, but there were a few features that could make these homes a little more bearable. For example, the Romans did have some clever ideas for keeping their homes a little warmer, even if they weren't perfect. And the more affluent your household, the more likely you were to have access to those better solutions. The wealthy Romans knew how to manage their homes in the winter, and it was more than just firewood. They were a society of innovators, and they managed to invent a few tricks that helped them out. Historians still argue about just how comfortable Romans were in their winter homes, given the lack of modern technology. But we can say with confidence that while they weren't exactly living in the lap of luxury, they certainly made do with what they had. So, how did Romans manage to stay warm in these drafty, cold homes? Well, to put it simply, they had fire, lots of it. The basic heating method for most Romans in winter was a good old-fashioned hearth or brazier placed right in the middle of the room. These fire sources could range from a small, portable brazier that you'd move from room to room to a more permanent hearth in the center of the home. The fire provided much needed heat and also a space for cooking, which, if you've ever tried to cook over an open flame, you'll know is both an art and a bit of a safety hazard. But while the fire could offer warmth in certain rooms, it came with a few drawbacks. The biggest issue was how inefficient it was at distributing heat. Most Roman homes, especially the smaller, poorer ones, didn't have chimneys. That meant smoke from the fire often filled the room, making it harder to breathe and more difficult to keep the fire going. If you had the misfortune of being in one of those apartment blocks, the smoke would rise and seep into the other rooms, making everything just that much more uncomfortable. The walls might be cold, but at least you'd get a few sparks of heat from your fire, even if they were more for light than warmth. Historians still argue whether ancient Romans developed any sort of fireproofing or heat dissipation strategies to improve the effectiveness of these hearths. Some say They used reflective materials around the fire to try to bounce heat into the room, while others think the idea of reducing smoke was an afterthought that never quite made it into the public domain. Regardless, fires were central to winter survival, and Romans would gather around them for warmth, cooking, and even socializing. But of course, fire isn't the only method the Romans use to fight the cold. The most impressive and probably most famous heating method they came up with was the hypocaust system. If you were wealthy enough to live in a grand villa or public bath, this might be the heating solution you'd get. It was, quite literally, the underfloor heating of its day, and it was about as cool or warm as ancient technology gets. Now, let's talk about the hypocaust system, one of the Romans' most ingenious inventions when it came to winter warmth. Imagine walking into a Roman villa or bath, and the first thing you notice is the floor. Not just any floor, mind you, but a floor that feels warm beneath your feet, like you're walking on an invisible, gentle source of heat. This wasn't magic. It was the hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that became a hallmark of Roman engineering. The word hypocaust actually comes from the Greek words hypo, meaning under, and caust, meaning burnt, which is pretty much the perfect description of how it worked. Essentially, a hypocaust was a furnace placed outside the building that fed hot air into an empty space beneath the floor. The floor itself was raised on pillars, leaving a gap below it where the hot air would circulate. This was a sophisticated system, with channels and ducts designed to move that air through the room, warming the stone floors above, and, in some cases, the walls too. The heat would then rise gently into the room, warming the entire space evenly, which was a far cry from the chaotic, uneven heat of the typical Roman hearth. For all its brilliance, however, the hypocaust wasn't perfect. The system required constant attention. You had to keep the furnace burning, which meant a steady supply of fuel. And unless you were in a larger villa or a public bathhouse, you probably wouldn't have the resources to keep it running efficiently. It wasn't the kind of system that could be left alone for days on end. Moreover, it wasn't cheap. Only the wealthiest Romans, or those in large public spaces like baths, could afford the luxury of a hypocaust. So, while the system was revolutionary, it wasn't exactly universal. Historians still argue about how widespread the hypocaust was across the Roman Empire. Some believe it was mostly reserved for the elite, while others think it could have been more common in cities with advanced infrastructure. What's certain, though, is that this system demonstrated the Romans' obsession with comfort and their skill in engineering solutions to everyday problems. But even with all that technology, the poor were still left to huddle around their basic hearths, heating their homes the old-fashioned way. While the hypocaust system might have been the height of Roman ingenuity, it wasn't the only way Romans managed heat in larger public spaces like bathhouses, theaters, and even some grand villas. Public baths, in particular, required extensive heating due to the large amounts of space that needed to be warmed to make the experience enjoyable. The typical Roman bath was a massive complex with different rooms kept at varying temperatures, ranging from cool plunge pools to the scorching hot caldarium or hot bath. And of course, you needed a way to ensure all of this heat didn't just dissipate into the air. Enter the hypocaust once again, but on a grander scale. To heat these enormous spaces, the Romans didn't just rely on small furnaces. They built large, purpose-designed heating systems that pumped steam and hot air into the rooms. These were connected to subterranean chambers where hot air would be generated by a furnace and circulated beneath the floors and through the walls. The combination of hot air and steam worked wonders in providing an even heat that kept bathers comfortable throughout the colder months. In theaters, the Romans used similar technology. It wasn't as complex as the bathhouses, but large open theaters or amphitheaters would often have central heating elements, possibly through underground tunnels or channels. The Romans were all about comfort and convenience, and they were willing to invest in these massive heating solutions. But these public heating systems came with some significant challenges. Not every city could afford such expensive, intricate setups, and even the wealthiest homes didn't always have the resources to heat a massive public space like a bathhouse. The quality and effectiveness of heating in these public places depended heavily on the resources and manpower of the city or private patron. Historians still argue about how widespread these public heating systems really were. After all, not every Roman bathhouse or theater had a hypocaust. Some scholars believe that only the wealthiest cities or areas of the empire had access to these luxury systems. Nonetheless, even with their impressive engineering, they were still labor-intensive and dependent on a constant supply of fuel and skilled labor. As we've already seen, the elite in ancient Rome had the luxury of underfloor heating, large fires, and even heated public spaces like baths. But what about the rest of the population? Those living in insulae, the crowded apartment blocks that housed the poor citizens, were left to contend with much less. For most of them, winter meant struggling to stay warm in a home that was built more for ventilation than for comfort. The division between the wealthy and the poor in Roman society extended into the realm of warmth. The rich could afford villas with advanced heating systems like the hypocaust and braziers that provided better heat distribution. Meanwhile, the lower classes were left to rely on simple solutions like small braziers that could be moved from room to room, or basic hearths that barely warmed the room. These modest homes were poorly insulated and often damp, which meant that the cold didn't just come from the air, it came from the very walls of the building. For the poor, the struggle to stay warm didn't end with fire. Insulae were often overcrowded, with families sharing rooms and sometimes even beds, just to huddle together for warmth. This created a sort of communal heat source, as body heat became just as essential as the flames in the brazier. But in these cramped living conditions, privacy was minimal and comfort was even more scarce. Historians still debate how much of this cold was simply part of life for the lower classes. Some believe the poor in Rome simply learned to endure it, while others suggest that these conditions could have led to a more communal and collective way of coping with winter. Regardless of the nuances, there's no denying that the gap between the Roman elite and the common people was not just one of wealth, but of comfort and warmth. Even so, this disparity was built into the fabric of Roman society. If you had the money, you could afford a villa with a hypocaust, or at least a solid fireplace. If not, you would have to make do with a simple brazier and whatever body heat you could gather. It wasn't exactly a fair system, but it was the reality for most Romans. In the Roman world, gathering around the fire was about more than just staying warm. It was a social ritual, a time when families and neighbors came together to share stories, cook meals, and escape the worst of the winter cold. The hearth was the heart of the home, and the fire wasn't merely a source of heat, it was a symbol of comfort, community, and life itself. If you lived in a Roman domus, the hearth was often located in the atrium, a large central hall that was the focal point of the house. The fire here was not just for warmth, but for lighting and cooking as well. The warmth from the flames would spread through the room, offering a temporary refuge from the cold. Roman families would gather around the hearth to eat, converse, and even perform rituals. They would cook simple meals of stews, grains, and vegetables, sometimes roasted over the fire. This wasn't just practical, it was also a moment for family bonding, a chance to relax and share the news of the day. Historians still argue about how much of this time around the fire was about warmth versus the need for a shared space to gather. While we might see it today as a cozy family moment, the reality was probably more utilitarian, keeping warm, cooking, and lighting the home in the same place. That said, the fire became a backdrop for many of the personal rituals and daily routines that made up Roman domestic life. For example, it wasn't uncommon for Roman families to conduct religious rituals by the fire. They would make offerings to the gods, burn incense, and sometimes even sacrifice small animals as part of their devotion. But it wasn't all pious and practical. The fire also offered a bit of entertainment. Families might tell stories or listen to music, especially during the long, dark winter evenings. Imagine, then, the fire crackling as stories of distant lands and legendary heroes filled the room. It wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about making the cold season a bit more bearable and perhaps even a little enjoyable. For the poor living in insulae, however, these rituals were likely much simpler. Gathering around a small brazier with the family might not have had the same grandeur as in a domus, but it still served the same purpose: survival, comfort, and community. There, families would cook basic meals, often using whatever space they could find to squeeze in around the fire. The close proximity to the flame would offer both warmth and light, but it would also make the air thick with smoke. The poorer Romans didn't have the luxury of ventilation or the advanced heating systems the wealthy had. Their fires filled the rooms with the scent of burning wood, often making the air more oppressive than it was warming. But let's not forget that the Romans didn't just rely on fires to keep warm. They had a pretty sophisticated way of dressing for the cold. In fact, Roman fashion was designed with practicality in mind, especially when it came to staying warm. The average Romans would layer their clothing, piling on woolen tunics, cloaks, and sometimes even fur to keep out the chill. Wool was the material of choice, not just because it was readily available, but because it was also a great insulator, trapping air and keeping the body warm. In the colder months, Roman men and women would wear multiple layers. For the wealthy, this might include a tunic made of fine wool, topped with a toga, or a cloak made from thicker, warmer fabric. The toga wasn't just for ceremonial occasions. It was often worn as a practical piece of clothing, draped in such a way that it could provide warmth as well as dignity. For the lower classes, the basic woolen tunic was paired with simpler cloaks, though even these were often made of wool or rough-hewn fabrics that offered a surprising amount of warmth for the cost. Roman shoes were also designed to help protect against the cold. Sandals were common in the warmer months, but in winter, Romans would wear heavier footwear, often made from leather, to protect their feet from the cold and wet. Some Romans even wore fur-lined boots or slippers to keep their toes from freezing. Historians still argue about just how many layers Romans wore during the winter. Some scholars believe that the Romans had an innate sense of fashion, something of a proto-Instagram attitude to seasonal wear, while others argue that for practical reasons, Romans would have worn as many layers as they could to keep out the cold, with little regard for appearance. Regardless, we know that layering was key to surviving winter. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about staying alive. And, of course, it wasn't just about clothing. Romans also made use of other methods to stay warm, including the use of heated stones. The idea was simple: heat stones in the fire and then place them in beds or in clothing, much like how you might use a hot water bottle today. This practice was especially useful when sleeping in those cold, stone-floored homes. The heated stones would provide localized warmth and offer some respite from the chill during the night. But it wasn't all about practicality. The Romans also used woolen blankets, many of which were intricately woven and designed to trap as much heat as possible. For the wealthy, these blankets were often finely crafted, embroidered with decorative patterns. For the common folk, woolen blankets were still a staple, but they might have been much simpler, serving their primary purpose of warmth rather than decoration. The Romans were undeniably creative when it came to staying warm, but some of their heating practices were downright quirky. From heated stone pillows to burning herbs for warmth, they didn't shy away from trying unique methods to fight the cold. One fascinating and somewhat strange practice involved the use of hot stones. While we've already touched on how they were used to warm beds, the Romans also took the concept a bit further. They would sometimes place heated stones inside pillows, which would then be tucked under blankets to provide a comforting warmth as people slept. Imagine laying down after a long day, feeling the warm stone against your neck, a primitive version of today's electric blanket. But unlike modern technology, these stones would cool down much faster, so the warmth was fleeting, requiring a constant replenishment of heat throughout the night. For those who could afford the luxury, these stones were a small but effective form of insulation. Another quirky method for staying warm involved the burning of specific herbs. Romans, always on the lookout for ways to add some extra comfort to their lives, would sometimes burn herbs like rosemary, thyme, and laurel alongside the fire. Not only did these herbs provide a pleasant fragrance, but the belief was that they would emit a kind of warmth through their oils, giving the air a slightly warmer feeling, though this was, no doubt, more of a psychological comfort than a physical one. Historians still argue whether the Romans fully believed in the warming powers of these herbs, or if it was just a matter of adding ritual and aroma to the otherwise cold and dreary winter days. Some scholars believe that Romans may have understood the idea of aromatherapy to a certain extent, while others think that the burning herbs were a symbolic gesture more than anything else, a way to elevate the mundane task of staying warm into something more pleasant and spiritual. Either way, the practice was widespread enough to show how the Romans combined practicality with superstition, creating comforting environments through a combination of warmth and scent. One more unconventional method the Romans used to stay warm was the use of heated water in a bath. While public baths are often associated with hygiene and socializing, they also served as places of comfort and relaxation during the colder months. In wealthy homes, it wasn't unusual for water to be heated to warm up the floors, much like in the hypocaust system. For those who didn't have access to this luxury, however, the idea of immersing oneself in hot water was a welcome escape from the winter chill. The Romans recognized that not only did warmth in the bath comfort the body, but it also provided a sense of social relaxation, a break from the harsh cold outside. As we look back on all these ancient methods for surviving winter, it's clear that the Romans had a lasting influence on the way we heat our homes today. While their methods might seem primitive in comparison to our modern technology, they laid the groundwork for many of the heating innovations that would follow. Take the hypocaust system, for instance. The Romans didn't just come up with a way to heat their homes. They created a system that would inspire the heating technology of the future. Today, underfloor heating systems, which are commonly used in modern homes, still function on the same basic principles that the Romans pioneered. Their efforts in the realm of heating have had a lasting impact, and in some ways, we're still using their ideas to keep warm in the winter. Beyond the technical advancements, the Roman approach to warmth was also a reminder of the importance of comfort and community during the colder months. The hearth wasn't just a place to gather heat, it was a place to gather people. Just as Romans would sit together around the fire for warmth and companionship, we still often find ourselves huddling around heaters, fireplaces, and even coffee tables during the winter months. In that way, their winter rituals, whether by a brazier or a grand hippocaust, mirror our own need for connection during the chillier seasons of life. Historians still argue about the true legacy of Roman heating technology. Some claim that it was far too labor-intensive and expensive for wide adoption, while others point to its ingenuity and long-term influence on the development of modern heating methods. Regardless, the Romans' creative ways of tackling cold weather serve as a testament to their ingenuity, their resourcefulness, and their desire to make life a little more comfortable, even during the harshest seasons. As we wrap up this journey into the past, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. What once required constant vigilance and innovative engineering now takes place with the flick of a switch. But next time you turn up your thermostat, take a moment to think back to those Roman engineers, to the hypocausts that warmed their baths and villas, and to the way they gathered around the fire doing what we still do today, finding warmth and comfort in the company of others. Now, as the fires of the past fade into the night, it's time for us to relax into our own comforts. The ancient Romans did it their way, and now we do it ours, though the warmth they sought still echoes through time.